1,078,500 immigrants flocking to Germany, over 12,000 court rulings ignored in Belgium, and a frontline island named Lampedusa, completely paralyzed as its capacity is exceeded many times over. This is not the script of a dystopian movie, but the harsh reality of Europe stepping into 2026. The wave of migration is no longer a localized humanitarian crisis. It has morphed into a structural tumor, gnawing at the model of the rule of law and the social welfare system. From Sweden, where the spectre of foreign gang violence drives security indices down, to the Netherlands, where the coalition government collapsed swiftly after just 11 months due to political deadlock, the old continent is facing a terrifying expectation trap. Will the leading countries be able to withstand, or will we witness the permanent disintegration of the Schengen area and post-war liberal democracy? Let's break down the list of the top 10 European countries facing the risk of a comprehensive structural collapse if this immigration earthquake continues to spiral out of control. Look straight at the geopolitical map of Europe in 2026. If Rome was the heart of ancient civilization, then the frontline island of Lampedusa is now the thermometer measuring the fever of a continent in fracture. Italy cannot choose its geography, and this geographical isolation is turning the boot-shaped country into a lonely outpost, bearing the full brunt of the migration crisis along the central Mediterranean Sea route. In just the year 2024, a fierce wave of 451,600 people landed in this country. What is noteworthy? 86.2% of them come from countries outside the European Union. This is no longer a typical demographic shift. It is a profound cultural asymmetry crashing into a system that is already overwhelmed. 151,000 first-time asylum applications in a year, a sad record, an administrative burden capable of paralyzing any governance system. Imagine an initial reception center in Lampedusa, designed for just 400 people, but often stretched to accommodate thousands at once. This is perhaps what is called European solidarity. The outdated Dublin regulation is like a bitter legal joke, forcing the first country that migrants set foot in to bear the entire burden, inadvertently turning Italy into a gigantic geographical prison. To cope, the right-wing government of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had to resort to a time-buying measure, extending the administrative detention period from 3 months to 18 months. When there is no more room at home, people start thinking about exporting the problem. A deal to relocate refugees to Albania was signed, consuming a projected massive budget ranging from 670 million euros to over 1 billion USD. But this billion-dollar project was immediately met with a cold shower from the European Court of Justice, which froze it entirely on legal grounds, citing that countries of origin like Bangladesh or Egypt do not fall under the safe category. 1 billion USD in exchange for a legislative deadlock, a public investment deal that might only be found in the darkest chapters of modern politics. Not stopping there, to prevent the flow of people at its source, Rome indirectly funded the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept migrant boats, pushing them back to notorious detention camps with horrific punishments. The euros were spent, and post-war humanitarian values suddenly became a commodity that could be bargained for with cash. What are the consequences? In the southern region of Italy, the social security system, public services, and healthcare infrastructure are at risk of a comprehensive structural collapse. The key tourism industry is in decline. The trust of the local community has shattered, giving way to polarization and a wave of discontent that has erupted violently. When the people lose faith in the law, the first domino, named Italy, can completely unilaterally break the common rules to save itself, ending the consensus of the entire bloc. But will this crisis stop at the southern coast? No. When Italy is powerless to keep the flow of migrants at its borders, that flow does not disappear. It immediately heads north, where another massive welfare magnet awaits, and also where the most powerful political empire on the continent begins to fracture: Germany. If Italy is the door, then Germany is the large living room of the European common house. But this room is now completely full. As the largest final destination, the economic powerhouse of the continent is struggling under an overwhelming pressure on the social housing system and the federal welfare budget. The welcoming culture, willkommen culture, was once a source of proud tolerance, but now the shadow of that legacy weighs heavily on Berlin's politics like an uncontrollable immigration magnet. Let's look at the telling numbers to see the scale of the earthquake. In just 2024, Germany is facing a massive wave of 78,500 immigrants. This country has to process 230,000 first-time asylum applications, accounting for a quarter of the total applications across the entire European Union. The Afghan refugee community has exploded, reaching around 461,000 people by the end of 2024. To operate this massive integration machine, the budget allocated for courses and basic subsidies in 2025 had to be increased by an additional €302.8 million, pushing the total cost to a record €1.066 billion. €1 billion, an exorbitant price for an illusion of unlimited compromise. And when the coffers run dry, the patience of the voters also disappears. Concerns about the economy and the erosion of cultural identity have stoked the flames of support for the far-right party, Alternative for Germany. They swept through the eastern states like Saxony, Thuringia, and Brandenburg with over 30% of the votes. Then what had to happen, happened. The historic turning point in February 2025, AfD officially seized 152 seats in the federal parliament. This tremendous pressure forced the centre-right CDU-CSU alliance to do something unprecedented. Break down the traditional firewall of political norms to compromise with the most extreme ideologies. The immediate consequence appeared in the form of cold decrees. Germany unilaterally closed all internal borders, tearing apart the spirit of free movement of the Schengen Agreement. By October 2025, the naturalization law was ruthlessly tightened. The minimum residency period was extended from 3 years to 5 years, accompanied by stringent financial self-sufficiency conditions. But this tightening does not bring peace. It turns Germany into a hostile cauldron. Political motivated crime surged by 40% in 2024, with half of the incidents originating from far-right groups. What is the risk of collapse here? Germany's post-war liberal democratic model is being eroded to its core. Reinstating prolonged internal border barriers will suffocate the very export economy, the lifeblood that thrives on the free movement of Berlin. But while Germany struggles to tighten its land borders to rectify past mistakes, on the other side of the ocean, a country that severed ties with the EU with a promise of absolute border control is now helplessly watching its strait turn into an open illegal construction site. Step into a bar in London and ask about Brexit. They once sold British voters a supreme key to lock down the borders. But in 2025, that key shattered when the UK recorded a record 46,497 cases of illegal immigration. Among them, the number of people crossing the English Channel in small boats accounted for 89%, equivalent to 41,000 individuals. The consequence is a paralysed national asylum system with 94,000 pending applications as of March 2026. Millions of tax pounds vanish each day just to maintain temporary accommodation hotels, placing a suffocating burden on the already exhausted NHS public healthcare system. Behind that lies the cold sophistication of illegal gangs. The number of people crammed into each flimsy dinghy skyrocketed from 7 inches 2018 to 62 inches 2025, reaching 63 inches 2026. They are willing to gamble with the lives of migrants to optimize profits on each life journey. The post-Brexit paradox lies in the fact that the UK lost access to the EU's sharing mechanism, rendering it completely powerless in repatriating migrants back to mainland Europe. The repatriation agreement with France signed in August 2025 completely failed due to its minuscule scale. Result? The actual deportation rate for the period 2018 to 2025 reached a dismally low level, 4%. To appease public opinion, the British government proposed tightening immigration policies, extending the probation period from 5 years to 10 years. But the report from the Migration Advisory Committee reveals a bitter truth. This policy is driving highly skilled scientists and scholars out of the UK, creating a reverse brain drain. Meanwhile, the low-wage, subsidy-dependent labour group is determined to cling on at all costs. The risk of collapse here is the permanent loss of competitiveness in key industries and the British university system, pushing an angry public to trigger social riots. Brexit was sold as a solution to freezing borders, but why has the number of people crammed into each boat increased ninefold? When immigration policies inadvertently drive away intellectuals and retain welfare dependents, is Britain saving itself or self-destructing from within? If England is suffocating itself with post-Brexit administrative barriers, then just across the English Channel, France is facing an even harsher reality. irreparable fractures within its cities, where national law is rendered ineffective. In France, the crisis is not at the strait, it is right in the suburbs around Paris or Marseille. This is evidence of a generational failure to integrate migrants from the former North African colonies, turning these areas into pockets of poverty, hotspots of crime, and religious extremism. By 2025, the number of foreigners holding residence permits in France surged to 4.3 million. In just 2025, an additional 376,000 new legal migrants poured in, putting further strain on the already fractured infrastructure. Looking at the visa structure, you will understand why this system is unbalanced. Humanitarian and refugee visas account for up to 32%, while work visas only make up a modest 13%. The loss of control stems from the very legislative panic. Since 1945, France has passed more than 100 immigration law reforms, meaning an average of one new law every 2 years. A tangled web of regulations that are completely ineffective in practice. The impotence of the centrist faction paved the way for Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party to dominate public thinking, turning immigration into an existential threat to French identity and the principle of secularism. The pressure was so great that by early 2026, Justice Minister Gérald Darmanin had to propose a measure to freeze all legal immigration for 3 years. On the other hand, systemic discrimination drives the psychological discontent of young people of African descent to a peak, causing French society to live in constant fear. 70% of the French public agree that the country is overwhelmed by immigrants. The risk of collapse is imminent, as large-scale urban riots from the suburbs ignite the downfall of the Fifth Republic, and a victory for the far right in 2027 will drag the entire EU into an irreversible constitutional crisis. Take your eyes off the foggy Straits of England and head to the sun-drenched islands of the Mediterranean. But don't be mistaken. Behind the facade of a tourist paradise, Greece emerges as a cold security buffer zone for the rest of Europe. Located at a sensitive geopolitical crossroads, Athens received up to €3.38 billion in financial aid from Brussels. But this enormous sum was exchanged for a bitter outcome: a poorly managed reception system that fell into a state of severe overload. Bound by the EU-Turkey agreement, tens of thousands of people are permanently stranded on islands like Lesbos or Samos. This place has turned into literal human warehouses, outdoor prisons that imprison human rights. To survive and control the numbers, as ordered by high-ranking officials, Athens has quietly implemented systematic and illegal pushback operations in the Aegean Sea. Let's look directly at a hidden data gap. The actual number of people rescued is 29,000, but the officially announced number of entries is only 8,000. The gap of 21,000 people who disappeared without a trace is evidence that tens of thousands of people were forcibly pushed back to the opposing sea. On the mainland, the government cut cash and food aid, pushing 40% of the population in the camps, including 6,000 children, into hunger. The consequence is the collapse of the main tourism industry, and the local community falls into a state of profound migration fatigue as they are abandoned by both Athens and Brussels. The risk of collapse here is the formation of permanent zones of legal instability, and the normalization of border violence will permanently erode the credibility and legitimacy of the human rights standards that Europe prides itself on. Crossing the Greek buffer zone, the flow of migrants veers through forests and valleys to enter the Western Balkan corridor. But here, they run into an administrative steel wall erected by a small but determined country to stop the lifeblood of Central Europe. Austria blocks the exit of the Western Balkan migration route, and this geographical position forces them to endure the third highest ratio of immigrants to population in the entire European Union. The sudden surge of transit migrants has created enormous pressure on the domestic security system and the welfare budgets of the states. But let's strip away the reality. The driving force behind the border harshness in Vienna is entirely dictated by internal political maneuvers. The Austrian Freedom Party, a far-right force, has been remarkably successful in stoking public fear about the influx of migrants. To survive politically, the ruling centre-right Austrian People's Party had no choice but to shift its stance sharply to the right, normalising the entire harsh agenda of its opponent. As a result, Austria unilaterally suspended the Schengen free movement rules, imposed a hard cap on the number of asylum applications, and erected barbed wire fences. They amended the law to extend the administrative detention period for rejected asylum seekers to up to 18 months in isolated return centres. The government forces immigrants to sign something called an integration agreement with strict language requirements to extend their residency. As politicians continuously launch anti-immigrant media campaigns, the social trust of the native population is severely eroded by deep political polarization. From its position as a paradise of humanitarianism, Sweden has transformed into a place with the highest per capita suffering rate in Western Europe, up to 30 times that of the British capital, London. About 40 organized crime families of foreign origin are directly challenging and undermining the foundations of the welfare state. The investigation numbers have revealed the reality. Foreign-born individuals account for up to 80% of the victims and are behind 64% of the total perpetrators of serious crimes. As a result, Sweden's domestic security index plummeted from 8th to 14th place. This is the price of accepting mass immigration in the past but completely failing at integration. Socially isolated residential areas inadvertently turn the second generation of immigrants' children into easy prey for violent gangs. The discontent pushed the country to a turning point in October 2022, when Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson's government came to power through the TIDO agreement, which imposed extreme restrictions on immigration. They raised the minimum salary threshold for work permits to 28,480 SEK month, equivalent to 80% of the national median salary, immediately cutting the number of work permits issued by 50%. The time to apply for citizenship has been extended from 5 years to 8 years, along with a cultural test. The most shocking measure is in 2026, raising the voluntary repatriation grant to a record $31,000 just to expel those who cannot integrate. The risk of collapse here is that excessive tightening will create a massive shadow society of those who are expelled but refuse to leave, while stripping criminals of their citizenship will trigger a serious constitutional crisis. The Netherlands, a country with one of the highest population densities in the world, is currently completely paralyzed in terms of social housing, infrastructure, and public services. The issue of migration here has exceeded technical control, becoming the direct trigger for the collapse of Prime Minister Dick Schuff's coalition government on the 3rd of June 2025, just 11 months after the cabinet took office. The root cause seems to stem from the extreme stance of far-right politician Geert Wilders, leader of the PVV party. Wilders forced the coalition to accept a 10-point plan, using the military to patrol the borders, closing all refugee camps, and forcibly deporting even Syrian citizens with temporary residence permits. When the moderate partners refused because the plan violated the constitution, Wilders immediately withdrew all his ministers to dissolve the government, pushing the country into a chaotic early election. In the power struggle of the factions, migrants were inadvertently turned into scapegoats. The government deliberately delayed the Allocation Act, causing the responsibility of reception to not be shared, leading to severe overcrowding that forced thousands of refugees to live in high-cost emergency centres with terrible conditions. The consequence is that public trust in the political system has severely declined from 34% to just 23%, while core social issues such as addressing housing for indigenous youth have been completely frozen. The risk of collapse for the Netherlands lies in the prolonged state of paralysis and political polarization. The country's stubborn insistence on withdrawing from the EU's common asylum regulations will isolate itself and undermine its open economy, which is fundamentally based on trade. Welcome to Brussels, the unofficial capital of the European Union, where politicians daily preach about the rule of law and core values. But right at the foot of the magnificent parliamentary buildings, Belgium has been experiencing the longest and most severe asylum reception crisis in its history since October 2021. Thousands of asylum seekers, mostly single men, are systematically denied the right to housing, forced to live in limbo under bridges and in abandoned buildings despite the harsh winter. But here is the shocking behind-the-scenes truth. The Belgian Federal Asylum Reception Agency has been condemned by Brussels labour courts more than 12,000 times. That's right, you heard it correctly. Over 12,000 rulings demanding the provision of legal accommodation have been blatantly ignored by the executive branch of the Belgian government. They would rather accept accumulating financial penalties than enforce the law. The peak of coldness was revealed when Minister Annelien van Bossut proposed reducing accommodations from 35,000 to 11,000 places. Purpose: using the very images of people huddled and frozen on the streets as a deterrent tool, sending a ruthless message outside to prevent the influx of new arrivals to Belgium. The consequence is that more than 2,500 people are permanently homeless, turning abandoned buildings into disease hotspots, pushing local taxpayers into a state of extreme frustration as the urban environment deteriorates and security becomes unstable. In that context, the complex federal structure between the French-speaking and Dutch-speaking communities has completely paralyzed the political machinery. The risk of Belgium's collapse does not lie in the economy. It lies in the fact that when the executive branch openly tramples on the judicial branch, the principle of the rule of law, the supreme foundation of Belgian democracy, is officially put to collapse. Stepping into Poland's eastern border, forget the concept of spontaneous migration or a typical humanitarian crisis. Here, Poland is facing a direct military national security threat. To protect this outpost, Warsaw has had to burn billions of euros from its budget to build solid walls along hundreds of kilometers of the border, while also deploying more than 17,000 soldiers in a state of combat readiness. Because this is a hybrid warfare campaign planned and directly funded by the Minsk authorities, with strategic backing from Moscow to retaliate against EU sanctions. The flow of migrants from the Middle East and Africa has been turned into a living weapon. Belarus established a network of ghost travel agencies, issuing short-term visas, flying them directly to Minsk, and then using armed forces to escort them to the border, forcing them to cut through barbed wire to flood into Poland, aiming to exhaust NATO's security apparatus. In a life-and-death situation, in October 2024, Poland made a shocking decision, officially suspending the right to access the asylum process for those crossing the border from Belarus. EU leaders silently agreed, but international organizations condemned it harshly. The poor migrants suddenly became pawns caught in the crossfire. In the dense, swampy forests under the bone-chilling cold, dozens of people have quietly succumbed to exhaustion. The people in the border region have to live under a prolonged martial law regime, an economic collapse, and the burden of taxes to maintain a massive military apparatus weighing heavily on their shoulders. The risk of collapse here is extremely serious. Maintaining a highly militarized border with frequent clashes poses the danger of unintended armed confrontations between soldiers on both sides, directly dragging the entire NATO bloc into a total war with the Minsk-Moscow axis. 10 countries, 10 fatal cracks along the length of the continent. What we have just dissected are no longer local incidents, but clinical symptoms of a system self-destructing from within the heart of Europe in 2026. Europe was once a symbol of prosperity, law, and tolerance. But today, the old continent is not collapsing due to an external invasion. It is self-destructing due to its own inability to resolve its greatest historical crisis. What do you think about this downward spiral of Europe? Please leave your comments in the section below. Don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next sharp geopolitical investigative documentary. The video content is based on statistics, legislative reports, and geopolitical data up to 2026. The information is analyzed to provide an objective perspective on the political system, without targeting any individual, ethnic group, religion, or nation. Viewers need to form their own personal opinions in the spirit of respecting the truth and international law.